My name is Hannah Reyes. I am 34 years old, and I work as a hospice social worker in Albuquerque, New Mexico. For 2 years, I drove nearly 3 hours round trip almost every single weekend to take care of my father, paid over $1,000 a month out of my own pocket toward his home health aide, and never once thought to ask my stepmother for a copy of his financial paperwork, because she'd always said she was handling it, and because I trusted her completely. Then, on the day we moved my father into memory care, the intake coordinator slid a folder across the desk and asked, almost casually, "And you're aware of the power of attorney your father signed in March of last year?" I wasn't aware of it. I'd never seen it, never heard a word about it. And by the time I got home that night and finally let myself sit with what that meant, I'd started pulling at a thread that, over the next 2 months, would slowly unravel almost everything my stepmother had quietly done with my father's life and finances for the better part of a year. Before I get into it, if you're new here, welcome. I tell stories like this one most days, usually true, usually about families, and usually about the quiet, easy-to-miss things that happen inside them. If that's something you're into, consider subscribing and drop a comment with where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. I genuinely love reading those. Okay, let me back up to the beginning. I grew up in Albuquerque, New Mexico, the only child of Raymond and Carol Reyes, in a small ranch-style house in the North Valley with a big cottonwood tree in the front yard that my dad always swore he was going to trim next spring, and never quite got around to. My dad drove long haul for almost 30 years, mostly routes between Albuquerque and Phoenix, sometimes out to El Paso or up to Denver. And my mom worked the front desk at a dental office in the same strip mall for 22 years, until she died of ovarian cancer when I was 26. That was 2018. My dad was 65 then, recently retired. And for about 3 years after my mom died, he lived alone in the house I grew up in, on a quiet street in the North Valley, with a garden he'd never had time for while he was driving and now had nothing but time for. I should say a little more about my parents' marriage first, because I think it matters for understanding why I trusted things the way I did later. My mom and dad were married for 36 years. My dad was gone a lot when I was growing up, sometimes 3 or 4 nights a week, sometimes longer hauls that kept him away for a week or more, and my mom ran the household in a way that, looking back, was almost entirely independent. She paid the bills, she made the decisions about my school, she fixed what broke around the house with a toolbox she kept under the kitchen sink. My dad, when he was home, was warm and funny and a little bit like a guest in his own life. He'd cook big breakfasts on his days off, take me fishing at Cachiti Lake, and otherwise mostly let my mom run things because that's what worked for them. When my mom died, in 2018, my dad was lost in a way I don't think I fully appreciated at the time. He'd never paid a bill in his life, not really. He didn't know which day the mortgage was due, or how the cable account worked, or where the important documents were kept. I drove up most weekends that first year and helped him learn all of it, sitting at the kitchen table with him going through statements, setting up online accounts, writing out a little notebook of passwords in his shaky handwriting. By 2020, he'd gotten reasonably comfortable with the basics, enough to manage day to day, but it had been a process. And I think that process is part of why, a few years later, when Brenda offered to take it off his plate, it felt to both of us like a relief rather than a loss. He met Brenda Voss in 2021 at a community center line dancing class that his cardiologist had basically ordered him to attend. Brenda was 61 then, twice divorced, no kids, originally from Roswell, and had moved to Albuquerque a few years earlier to be closer to her sister. They got married about 8 months after they met, quickly, by my standards, but my dad was lonely in a way I hadn't fully appreciated until I saw how different he seemed with Brenda around. He laughed more, he started cooking again. For a while, I was genuinely glad. I want to be honest about something up front. I don't think Brenda married my father purely for financial reasons, and I'm not going to tell this story like she's a cartoon villain who planned all of this from day one. I think what happened here happened gradually, in small steps, each of which probably felt justifiable at the time, and that's part of what makes it so hard to talk about, even now. The wedding itself was small, a backyard ceremony at my dad's house, maybe 30 people, a caterer who did carne adobada and a sheet cake from a bakery on 4th Street. I gave a short toast. I remember saying something about how glad I was that my dad had found someone who made him laugh again, and I meant every word of it. Brenda's sister, a woman named Carol, not the Carol I mentioned, my mother, a different Carol, which always felt like an odd coincidence to me, gave a toast too, about how Brenda deserved happiness after 2 marriages that didn't deserve her. At the time, that line struck me as just wedding speech kindness. Looking back, I sometimes wonder if it was also, in its way, a little bit true, and a little bit a warning I didn't know how to hear. For the first year or so of the marriage, things were genuinely good, as far as I could tell. Brenda moved into the house, my childhood home, and redecorated some of it, which stung a little at first but which I got over quickly, because it was her home too now, and because my dad seemed happier with the changes than I expected. She was warm to me in a slightly formal way, not a stand-in mother, never trying to be that, but friendly, interested in my work. The kind of stepmother relationship that I think can actually work quite well for adults, where nobody's pretending to be something they're not, and everyone's just trying to get along. The first sign that something had shifted came about 2 years into the marriage, in early 2023, when my dad mentioned, almost in passing, during one of our Sunday phone calls, that Brenda had taken over the bill paying, since she's better with the online stuff than I am. At the time, this seemed completely reasonable. My dad was 78, had never been comfortable with computers, and Brenda was 63 and had worked in office administration for years before retiring. It made sense that she'd handle the logins, the auto-pay, the day-to-day. What I didn't fully register, at the time, was that handling the bill paying had quietly expanded to include things like the joint checking account my parents had shared since the 1990s, my dad's modest investment account, about $58,000 in a mix of CDs and savings bonds, money he'd been putting away steadily since his trucking days, and a 1/8 timeshare-style ownership share in a small cabin property near Ruidoso that he and 3 old trucking buddies had bought together back in 2002, which the 4 of them and their families had used for ski trips and summer weekends for over 20 years. My dad's memory had been getting noticeably worse since late 2022. Small things at first, repeating questions, misplacing his keys more than usual, once getting genuinely lost driving to a grocery store he'd shopped at for 15 years. I remember a phone call from that period that I think about often now. My dad called me on a Wednesday afternoon, sounding shaken, and said he'd driven to the grocery store on Montgomery, the one he'd gone to for 15 years, and had sat in the parking lot for almost 20 minutes because he couldn't remember which entrance the store was, even though he was looking right at it. Brenda had driven out to get him. At the time, we both told him it was probably just stress, or dehydration, or one of the dozen explanations people reach for before they're ready to consider something more serious. In early 2024, after a neurology workup that included an MRI and a battery of cognitive tests, he was diagnosed with moderate vascular dementia, likely related to a couple of small strokes he'd apparently had without anyone noticing, what they call silent strokes. I drove up for the appointment where we got the results, and I remember my dad's reaction more than the doctor's words. He nodded along, asked a couple of practical questions about medication, and then, in the car afterward, asked Brenda and me, almost cheerfully, where we wanted to get lunch, as if the appointment had already folded itself into the background of his day. I think that was the moment I understood, on some level, that I was going to need to start paying much closer attention to everything. And the moment, ironically, that I started trusting Brenda with more, not less, because someone needed to be there every day, and that someone wasn't going to be me. The diagnosis explained a lot, and it also meant everything was about to change very quickly. From early 2024 onward, I started driving up from my apartment. I live and work as a hospice social worker, which is its own strange irony I'll get to later most weekends, sometimes midweek too if Brenda called and said Dad was having a hard day. I helped arrange a home health aide, a woman named Carmen who came 3 mornings a week to help my dad shower, manage his medications, and just generally keep an eye on him while Brenda was out. Brenda still worked part-time at a furniture store a few towns over, 2 or 3 shifts a week, which again seemed completely normal. Carmen's services cost $1,150 a month, and from the very first month, I paid for it myself, directly, by check, made out to the home health agency. I didn't make a big deal out of this. My dad's only income was Social Security and a small pension from his trucking years, and it felt natural for me to step in, the way I imagine a lot of adult children do when a parent starts needing more help than their fixed income can stretch to cover. Over about 22 months, that came to just over $25,000. I want to talk for a moment about my job, because I think it shaped how I responded to all of this more than almost anything else. I've worked as a hospice social worker for 9 years, mostly with families in the last weeks and months of a loved one's life. Part of my job, every single week, is sitting with adult children, sons and daughters in their 30s, 40s, 50s, who are watching a parent decline. Often a parent who remarried after their other parent died, and often navigating exactly the kind of blended family dynamics I was living through myself. I've sat at a lot of kitchen tables where a step-parent and an adult child were trying to figure out, in real time, who was responsible for what, who got to make which decisions, and how to talk about money without it feeling like betrayal in either direction. If anything, my job made me more careful than most people would have been. I knew, professionally, how often these situations go wrong, how often resentments calcify, how often siblings or step-parents stop speaking entirely over things that started as small misunderstandings. So I went out of my way to be generous, to assume good faith, to not ask too many pointed questions, because I'd seen, over and over, what happens to families when someone starts keeping score too early. What I didn't fully account for is that the same instinct, give people room, assume good faith, don't keep score, can also be exactly what allows a problem to grow quietly for a long time before anyone notices it. I also paid for a stair rail installed in the hallway, about $640, and a medical alert pendant, which was $35 a month. Small things, here and there, the kind of expenses that don't feel significant individually, but that I was tracking, because that's just how my brain works. I keep a budget spreadsheet for everything, a habit from years of being a single person managing my own finances carefully. I never asked Brenda to contribute to any of it, and she never offered. But she also never seemed to need to, as far as I knew, my dad's Social Security and pension, plus whatever Brenda brought in from her part-time job, were covering the household bills just fine. By the fall of this year, my dad's dementia had progressed to the point where Carmen's 3 mornings a week weren't enough, and Brenda, to her credit, I want to say clearly, was the one who first raised the idea of memory care. She called me on a Tuesday evening, and I could hear in her voice that she'd been crying. "I can't leave him alone anymore, even for an hour," she said. "I love him, Hannah, but I'm scared something's going to happen when I'm at work or even just in the shower." We looked at 3 places together over the following 2 weeks. Brenda drove. I came up from Albuquerque each time, and we settled on a place called Sandia Vista Memory Care, about 15 minutes from the house. It was $5,800 a month, which felt like an enormous number when Brenda first said it out loud in the parking lot, but the facility was clean and warm. The staff seemed genuinely kind, and my dad on the tour seemed calmer there than I'd seen him in months. He liked the courtyard, the small garden beds where residents could plant things. We moved him in on a Thursday in early October. I'd driven up the night before and stayed at the house, in my old childhood bedroom, which Brenda had turned into a sewing room but still kept a daybed in, so I could help load his things in the morning. That night, before bed, I went looking for a box of old photo albums I remembered from when I was a kid, thinking I might bring a few framed pictures for my dad's new room, familiar faces, something to anchor him. The albums were in the hall closet, mostly undisturbed, but on the shelf above them, I noticed an accordion folder I didn't recognize, labeled in Brenda's handwriting. R. Financial. I didn't open it. I remember standing there for a second, my hand resting on it, and then telling myself it wasn't my business, that everything had a place in this house that wasn't mine to rearrange, and going back to packing photo albums instead. I think about that moment a lot now, how close I came to just looking, and how easily I talked myself out of it. The move itself was hard in the ordinary ways these things are hard. My dad got confused and upset partway through, asked several times why he couldn't just go home, and then, by early afternoon, seemed to settle in better than any of us expected, sitting in the courtyard with another resident, talking about trucking routes from 40 years ago like it was yesterday. I sat on a bench nearby, half listening, and watched him point out an imaginary highway interchange in the air with his finger, describing a stretch of I-40 outside Gallup the way some people describe a favorite hiking trail. Every curve, every landmark, still completely intact in his memory, even as so much else had started to slip. After we got him settled, Brenda and I sat down with the facility's intake coordinator, a woman named Pam, to go over paperwork. Insurance forms, medication lists, emergency contacts, the usual. And it was Pam, flipping through a folder, who said, without any particular weight to it, "And I see here you're the power of attorney, Mrs. Voss, and Hannah, you're listed as the secondary contact. Just want to confirm those details are still current." I remember looking at Brenda. I remember Brenda not quite looking at me. And I remember saying, as evenly as I could manage, "I'm sorry, power of attorney. When was that signed?" If you've ever found out something about your own family that nobody thought to mention, not maliciously, maybe, but just never mentioned, type family in the comments. I'd really like to know how common this actually is. Pam pulled the document and showed it to us, a standard durable power of attorney form, notarized, dated March 14th of last year, naming Brenda as my dad's agent with broad authority over his financial affairs. My dad's signature was on it. It looked like his handwriting, but shakier than I remembered it being even a year ago. And March of last year, I realized later, was right around the time his neurologist had increased his medication dosage after a rough patch. A period I remembered Brenda describing to me on the phone as one of his confused weeks. Brenda's explanation in the car afterward, she drove me back to get my car since I'd parked at the house, was that the lawyer said it was just a formality in case something happened and I needed to make decisions for him. I didn't think it was a big thing. I probably should have mentioned it, There was so much going on that month, with his medication change and everything. She seemed genuinely a little flustered. And at the time, I told her it was fine, that I understood, that of course she'd need that kind of authority given everything she was doing for him day to day. But that night, back at my apartment, I couldn't stop thinking about the date. March of last year was also, I realized after checking my own records, around the time I'd noticed a strange gap in my dad's CD statements. One of his certificates of deposit, a $22,000 one that had been set to mature that spring, wasn't on the most recent statement I'd seen forwarded to me. At the time, I'd assumed it had simply rolled over into a new CD under a different account number, the way banks sometimes do, and I hadn't thought about it again. Now, with this POA in my hands, it didn't feel like something I could just not think about. I want to pause here and say something about why I hadn't looked more closely before. Part of it is that I work in hospice. I spend my days sitting with families at the end of someone's life, and I see, constantly, how exhausting and humbling caregiving is, how even good, loving people get stretched so thin that things fall through the cracks. I genuinely believed Brenda was overwhelmed, doing her best, and that any gaps in what I knew were just gaps, not anything deliberate. I didn't want to be the kind of daughter who treated her father's wife with suspicion over paperwork, especially when that wife was the one doing the daily, hands-on work I couldn't do from 60 miles away. But once I started looking, really looking, with the kind of attention I bring to case files at work, I couldn't stop, and I couldn't pretend not to see what I was seeing. I called the bank first, the following Monday during my lunch break. I wasn't on the account, so they couldn't tell me much directly, but I asked, carefully, vaguely, whether a person with power of attorney would receive statements at a different address than the account holder. The representative, without quite confirming anything, said that was common practice. Yes, the agent often manages correspondence. That told me what I needed to know. For the past year and a half, all of my dad's financial mail, statements, notices, everything, had likely been going to an address or inbox I didn't have access to, and I'd had no way of knowing, because I'd simply stopped seeing those statements without registering that I'd stopped seeing them. That evening, I drove up to see my dad, a regular Tuesday visit, nothing unusual, and afterward, instead of heading home, I stopped by to see our old neighbor, Gus Tilden. Gus is 76, lived 3 houses down from my parents for as long as I can remember, and had been one of my dad's closest friends since before I was born. They'd driven for the same trucking company for almost 2 decades. Gus's wife had passed a few years before my mom did, and the two of them, Gus and my dad, had spent a lot of time together in the years after coffee most mornings, fixing things in each other's garages, the kind of friendship that doesn't need much explaining. Gus answered the door in a flannel shirt with a coffee mug in his hand, and when he saw my face, he didn't ask why I was there at 7 in the evening on a Tuesday. He just stepped back and said, "Come on in, Hannah. I'll put the kettle on." Gus's house smelled like it always had, like pipe tobacco even though he'd quit smoking years ago, like the inside of a garage that doubled as a workshop. There was a model truck on his mantel, a scale replica of the actual rig he'd driven for 20 years, with the company logo painted on the side. A logo I recognized because my dad had the same one, somewhere in a box in his garage. We sat on his back porch, in 2 folding chairs that I suspect hadn't moved in a decade, looking out at a yard that had gone a little wild since his wife passed. Gus asked about my dad first, how he was settling in, whether the food was decent, whether they let him outside. I answered as best I could, and then I asked him, as gently as I could, whether he'd noticed anything different about my dad's situation over the past year or so, anything that had seemed off to him. Gus was quiet for a while. Then he said, I don't like to get in the middle of family stuff, Hannah, but since you're asking, yeah, there's been some things. He told me that, about a year and a half ago, my dad's old pickup truck, a 2009 Ford F-150 he'd kept in beautiful condition, washed it every weekend even after he stopped driving it much, had been sold. Gus had noticed it gone from the driveway one week and asked my dad about it, and my dad, even then, had seemed confused by the question. Brenda said something about it needing too much work, was the gist of what he'd told Gus, though Gus said my dad hadn't seemed entirely sure himself. Gus also mentioned the cabin in Ruidoso, the one my dad co-owned with 3 old trucking buddies, one of whom, a man named Earl, was also a friend of Gus's. Gus said Earl had mentioned, maybe 8 or 9 months back, that Raymond's share got bought out, that Brenda had reached out to the other 3 co-owners and arranged for my dad's 1/8 interest to be sold to one of them, a man named Pete, for what Gus described as way under what it was worth, knowing that property. Earl, according to Gus, hadn't thought much of it at the time. He'd assumed it was something my dad and Brenda had decided together, given everything going on with the dementia diagnosis, and it wasn't really his business to question. Before I left, Gus told me one more thing, almost as an afterthought, standing in his doorway as I was putting my shoes back on. He said that about a year ago, my dad had shown up at his house on a weekday afternoon on foot, which was unusual, since the house was a 15-minute walk and my dad rarely walked anywhere by then, and had seemed agitated, repeating that he needed to find his checkbook, and that Brenda said it was easier this way, but I don't like not knowing where things are. Gus said he'd made my dad a cup of coffee, calmed him down, and walked him home, and that by the time they got back, my dad seemed to have forgotten what had upset him in the first place. Gus said he'd mentioned it to Brenda when they got back, just in passing, that Raymond had been a little worked up about his checkbook, and Brenda had thanked him for walking my dad home and said she'd keep an eye on it. I should have called you about that one, Gus said, looking down at his hands. I thought about it, but it was right around when you were dealing with the diagnosis news, and everybody seemed like they had enough on their plates, and your dad seemed fine by the time I dropped him off. I'm sorry, Hannah, I should have called. I told him there was nothing to be sorry for, that he'd done exactly the right thing in the moment, walked a confused old friend home and made sure he was safe, and that nobody could be expected to see the whole picture from one afternoon. But I drove home that night with a list forming in my head, the CD that hadn't rolled over the way I'd assumed, the truck, the cabin share, the checkbook my dad had gone looking for, on foot, a year before any of this came to light. And now I had to find out what all of it actually added up to, and where the money had actually gone. Because if even some of it had gone toward my dad's care, I needed to know that too, and I didn't want to walk into this assuming the worst before I had real numbers. Here's something worth sitting with for a second. Only about 3% of people who watch videos like this one ever actually hit subscribe. If Hannah's story is holding your attention, that small click helps this channel keep finding stories like hers. Okay, back to it. I called an elder law attorney the next week, a woman named Sophia Marin, recommended by a colleague at the hospice who dealt with a similar situation with her own mother a few years back. Sophia was direct in a way I appreciated immediately. She explained that, as the secondary contact and my father's daughter, I had standing to petition for a review of the power of attorney, especially given the timing. A POA signed during a documented period of cognitive decline, shortly after a medication change, raises real questions about capacity at the time of signing. She also explained that I could request an accounting from Brenda, as the agent under the POA, of how my father's assets had been managed, and that if Brenda refused or the accounting didn't add up, there were further steps, up to and including a court-supervised review. "I want to be careful here," Sophia told me in our first meeting. "A lot of these situations aren't fraud, legally speaking. They're a spouse using shared or jointly understood money in ways the kids weren't told about, which might be unwise or even hurtful, but isn't necessarily illegal, especially if your father was competent at the time and verbally agreed to things even if he doesn't remember agreeing now. So the first step isn't accusations. It's just get the numbers. Then we'll know what we're actually dealing with." I requested the accounting through Sophia's office, formally, in writing, the following week. Brenda had 30 days to respond. While I waited, I did my own informal accounting, as best I could from what I had. The home health aid costs I'd paid, about $25,000 over 22 months, were documented in my own checking account, easy to total. The stair rail, the medical alert pendant, all of it, I had records for because I'd paid for it directly. What I didn't have until the accounting came back was a picture of what had happened on Brenda's side. What my dad's Social Security, pension, the CD money, the truck sale, and the cabin buyout had actually gone toward. When Sophia's office received Brenda's accounting, about 3 weeks later, Sophia called me in to go over it together. The numbers were not what I'd braced myself for exactly, but not nothing either. The CD, $22,000, had been cashed in March of last year, the same month the POA was signed. The truck had sold for $9,500, about $4,000 less than Gus thought it was worth, but not an outrageous lowball either. The cabin share had gone for $14,000 to the other co-owner. Pete, Sophia later confirmed, through a quick record search, that similar shares in that property had sold for closer to $19,000.22,000 around the same time, so that one probably was undervalued, though not dramatically. Total, about $45,500 had moved out of my dad's accounts and into a joint account Brenda had opened, a joint account in both their names. Technically, though my dad's dementia meant he had no practical ability to access or monitor it. Of that $45,500, Brenda's accounting showed roughly $19,000 spent on things that were plausibly his care in a broad sense. A portion of the home's property taxes and insurance, a new roof repair after a hailstorm, some of her own reduced work hours covered as caregiving time. The remaining roughly $26,500 was harder to account for, some withdrawals with no clear description. A few thousand spent on what looked like a vacation Brenda had taken with her sister to Arizona, and a chunk that had simply been moved into Brenda's own separate savings account, for emergencies, as her written explanation put it. Sophia and I talked through what this actually meant. It wasn't a story of someone stripping a vulnerable man of everything he had. My dad still had his house, his Social Security, his pension, and now, after the memory care move, those would go toward his $5,800 a month care costs, which was going to be tight but workable, especially once Sophia helped us look into a long-term care Medicaid pathway that could eventually help cover part of it. But it also wasn't nothing. $26,500 of my father's money he'd earned over 30 years of driving trucks, sitting in a cab away from his family for days at a time, had gone toward things that weren't really his care, during a period when he very likely hadn't had the clarity to understand or consent to any of it, while I had been separately paying $1,150 a month, real money, for the aide who helped keep him safe during that same period. Sophia's recommendation was not to pursue anything criminal. She was honest that proving intent to defraud versus a spouse who'd convinced herself this was all fine because it's our money, really, would be difficult and would also be devastating for my dad, who still, on his good days, asked about Brenda and seemed to genuinely miss her. Instead, Sophia recommended we petition to have the power of attorney reviewed by the court, given the capacity concerns around its signing. And separately, that I formally request reimbursement of $26,500 to my dad's accounts to be used toward his care costs going forward, which would directly offset some of what I'd otherwise need to keep paying out of pocket. I sat with that recommendation for a few days before deciding. Part of me, and I'm not proud of this part, but I want to be honest, wanted something more. I wanted Brenda to face some kind of consequence that felt proportional to 2 years of quietly paying for an aide while she'd been moving money into a separate account for emergencies. I talked to a friend of mine, another social worker named Priya, about it over coffee one evening, and she said something that stuck with me. You can want accountability and also want this to be over quickly, with the least damage to your dad. Those aren't contradictory. But you should be honest with yourself about which one you're actually choosing, because they don't always point the same direction. I thought about my dad in the courtyard, pointing at his imaginary highway interchange. I thought about how much time he might realistically have left where he still knew who I was, who Brenda was, where a courtroom process, even a civil one, even one that didn't involve him directly, would inevitably bleed into his remaining good days, because Brenda would be distracted, stressed, possibly less present at the facility during a period when stability mattered more than almost anything else. I decided that getting the money back and getting safeguards in place so this couldn't happen again mattered more to me than getting a verdict that named what had happened. Sophia said that was a completely reasonable place to land, that she'd seen families go both ways, and that there wasn't a version of this that was correct. Only versions that fit what each family needed most. The conversation with Brenda happened at Sophia's office, with Sophia present, not a courtroom, nothing dramatic, just a conference table and a folder. Brenda looked smaller than I'd ever seen her. She didn't deny the numbers, she couldn't, really, they were just numbers, pulled from statements. What she said, mostly, was some version of, I never thought of it as taking anything. It felt like our money. I've given up so much of my own life for him these past few years, Hannah, and I guess somewhere along the way I started thinking I'd earned a little of it back. I didn't yell. I want to be honest that some part of me wanted to in the moment, but mostly what I felt was tired and a little sad more than angry. I told her I understood that caregiving is exhausting and that I genuinely believed she loved my dad. But I also told her that the $26,500 needed to go back, because it was the difference between my dad's remaining money lasting through his care or not, and that if she'd asked me, at any point in the last 2 years, for help, I would have helped, the way I'd been helping all along, instead of finding out about all of this from a stranger at an intake desk. Brenda agreed to the repayment, structured over 18 months, since she didn't have $26,500 sitting around to write a check for. To her credit, she didn't push back on the structure Sophia proposed, and she's made every payment on time so far, the first 3 arriving a few days early, actually, which I noticed and which mattered to me more than I expected it to. The court reviewed the POA about 6 weeks later and modified it significantly. Brenda remains a co-agent for day-to-day medical decisions, given her ongoing relationship with my dad and her familiarity with his care team, but financial decisions above a small threshold now require my sign-off as well. And an annual accounting is now a formal requirement, reviewed by Sophia's office. Sophia told me, after the hearing, that the judge had been fairly gentle about the whole thing, that these cases come through her courtroom more often than people realize, and that most of them, like ours, aren't really about villains. They're about two sets of eyes being better than one, especially once a parent can no longer provide either set themselves. One unexpected outcome of the court review was that it also formally established me as a co-trustee on a small trust my dad had apparently set up years earlier, something neither Brenda nor I had been fully aware of, a leftover from some estate planning my mom had done back in the early 2000s that had simply never been updated or really discussed since. It didn't have much in it, a few $1,000s earmarked vaguely for education or emergencies. But Sophia said it was a good example of how much paperwork accumulates in a life like my dad's. 30 years of trucking, 2 marriages, a house, small accounts opened and half forgotten, and how easy it is, especially once dementia enters the picture, for nobody to have the full map of it anymore. Part of what this whole process did, beyond the immediate issue with Brenda, was finally give someone, me now, formally, a complete picture of my dad's finances for the first time in years. In a strange way, even with everything that happened, I think that's a good thing. It's something I should have had years ago, regardless of Brenda, just as his only child and the person most likely to be managing all of this eventually anyway. My dad doesn't really understand most of this. By the time it was all resolved, his memory had declined enough that explaining it to him would have just been confusing and upsetting, for no benefit to him. He settled into Sandia Vista better than I expected. He still likes the courtyard. He started a small bed of chili peppers there, with help from one of the aides, and every time I visit, he tells me about it like it's news, and I let it be news every time. A few weeks ago, I brought him one of the framed photos I'd packed that night before the move, an old picture of him standing next to his rig, somewhere outside Gallup, taken sometime in the late 1980s, my mom's handwriting on the back noting the date. I set it on the little shelf in his room, and he picked it up, studied it for a long moment, and said, "That's a good truck. I drove that one for years." He didn't recognize himself in the photo, not exactly. He talked about the driver almost like a third person, someone he knew and respected but wasn't quite identifying as himself. I didn't correct him. I just said, "Yeah." He took good care of it, and my dad nodded, satisfied, and set the photo back on the shelf, angled just slightly so he could see it from his chair. I also went back to Gus's house, about a week after the court hearing, just to let him know how things had turned out. I brought him a 6-pack of the beer he likes, and we sat on the porch again, and I told him the short version, the accounting, the repayment plan, the new arrangement with the POA. Gus listened quietly, and then he said, "Your dad's lucky, you know. Not about any of this." He gestured vaguely, meaning the whole situation, but that he's got a kid who'd go through all this for him. A lot of guys I drove with, their kids wouldn't have noticed or wouldn't have bothered. I told him I didn't feel like I'd done anything special, just paid attention, eventually, to things I probably should have been paying attention to all along. Gus shrugged and said, "Eventually's still something. A lot of people never get there at all." Brenda still visits him, most days, actually, more than I'm able to since she lives so much closer. I see her there sometimes, and it's awkward but not hostile. We've started slowly, doing something we never really did before all this, comparing notes. She'll text me after a visit. "He was tired today, didn't eat much at lunch." And I'll text back something about how he seemed on my last visit, and somewhere in those small exchanges, I think we're both quietly building toward something more workable than what we had before, even if neither of us has said that out loud. Last week, she was there when I arrived, sitting with my dad in the courtyard, and when I sat down, my dad reached over and patted both our hands, one after the other, and said, "My girls," the way he used to when I was small and Brenda and I would both show up to one of his birthdays. He doesn't remember any of what happened with the money. In some ways, I think that's the only mercy in any of this. I asked Brenda that day, while my dad was distracted watching another resident water the chili peppers, whether she'd given any more thought to what she'd said in Sophia's office, about feeling like she'd earned something back after everything she'd given up. She was quiet for a while, and then she said, "I think I was telling myself a story, honestly, about what I deserved. I don't think I was lying to you, exactly. I think I'd convinced myself first." I told her I appreciated her saying that, and I meant it. I don't think either of us is going to bring it up again after this. But I think it mattered that it got said once, out loud, between the two of us, instead of staying a thing that only existed in bank statements and a folder labeled R, financial. I've thought about this a lot since it all happened, and a few things stand out to me now that didn't back then. The first thing is about the danger of she's handling it. For 2 years, I let a phrase like that quietly replace my own attention to my father's affairs because it was easier and because I trusted the person saying it. I'm not saying you should distrust every caregiving spouse or partner in your family most of the time. She's handling it really does just mean someone's handling it. But it's worth checking in anyway, gently, regularly, not because you expect something wrong, but because attention itself is a kind of care, and it's easy to let it lapse when someone else seems to have things covered. The second thing is about timing. The power of attorney was signed during a documented bad week, a medication change, a period Brenda herself had described to me at the time as one of his confused weeks. I don't think that was necessarily planned, but it's a reminder that the worst weeks of someone's decline are exactly the weeks when major paperwork shouldn't be happening quietly, without other family members present or informed. The third thing is about the difference between our money and his money. Brenda and my dad had been married for years, and in a lot of ordinary, day-to-day ways, their finances probably did feel shared to her. But my dad's CDs, his pension, the cabin share he'd owned since before they even met, those weren't really theirs in the way she'd started to think of them. And I think a lot of harm in situations like this comes from that quiet reclassification, the slow shift from his to ours to, eventually, just mine when I need it. The fourth thing is about Gus and about neighbors and about the people who notice things and don't always say so unless you ask. Gus had seen the truck disappear, had heard about the cabin, and hadn't said anything, not because he didn't care, but because it wasn't his place, and because none of it seemed urgent enough on its own to raise. I think a lot of important information in families lives in places like that, in neighbors, in old friends, and it only surfaces if someone asks the right question at the right time. And the fifth thing, the one that stayed with me the most, is about what actually matters in the end. The $26,500 matters, practically, because it's the difference between my dad's care being sustainable or not. But when I sit with him in that courtyard, and he tells me about his chili peppers for the third time that week, none of the accounting matters at all. What matters is that he's safe, and that he's not afraid, and that when Brenda and I are both there, he still, for whatever time he has left, gets to feel like he has both of his girls with him. I think about my job a lot, sitting in that courtyard, about all the families I've sat with over the years, at the very end, when none of the earlier disagreements seem to matter anymore, when everyone in the room just wants the person in the bed to be comfortable, to not be afraid, to know they're loved. I used to think of that as something that happens at the very end, a kind of grace that arrives late, almost too late. What I've learned this year is that it doesn't have to arrive late. Brenda and I found a version of it months before the end, sitting in a courtyard full of chili peppers, and I'm grateful every day that we didn't wait. If this story meant something to you, I'd love to know, has your family ever had a she's handling it moment that turned out to be more complicated than it seemed? Tell me about it in the comments. I read every one. My dad's chili peppers, by the way, are apparently doing very well according to him, and according to the aide who actually tends them, they're going to be the best ones in the courtyard this year. I plan to be there when they're ready, whenever that is, with Brenda, the way we are now, two people who learned something hard about each other and decided it was still worth showing up. Thanks so much for watching and for sitting with Hannah's story today. I'll see you in the next one.